morning and welcome to the third and final day of the 16th annual MIT CDOIQ Symposium. This is track 1, Environment, Social and Governance, Better Data Insights, Enabling Companies' ESG Goals to Ultimately Benefit Society. I'm your track producer, Robert Lutton, Vice President, Sandal Consultants, and I'd like to welcome everyone here and everyone virtually online to this fantastic session on innovation at scale, driving innovation within the Department of Defense acquisition community. So just before I introduce the excellent panel in front of or behind me, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping notes. One, this session is being recorded. This recording will be available with the proceedings online at no additional charge, and video recordings will be uploaded to our CDOIQ YouTube channel 3 months after the symposium. For our attendees live, there are microphones here, or if you want to have a question at the end or at the end of the session in the Q&A section, please either go to the microphone or stick your hand up. We've got a runner in the room. And also for our attendees online, please use the Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring that. So today I have the pleasure of introducing a great bunch of MIT CDOIQ supporters. Let's start with Mark Krzysko, who is the Principal Deputy Director for Acquisition Data and Analytics, DoD. Mark, hello, welcome. And you've brought a great panel with you today, starting with Phil Anton, the Chief Scientist at AIRC. That's Phil. Followed by Laura Freeman, who is the Director of Hume Center of National Security and Technologies Intelligence Systems, Virginia Tech. Get that right? And finally, another one of our favorites, Michael Conlin from CTO Definitive Logic. Is that correct? Excellent. Mark, I'll pass it over to you. Your mic is live.
All right. Thank you, Robert. I do want to take a moment to thank Rich and Robert. It is no small chore to put this together, and we can only do this with their support. I'd also like to mention, for Michael Conlin's introduction, many of you also know him as the former first CDO and first data and analytics officer across from the Department of Defense. I'm very grateful that Michael has joined us today. Great colleague over the years, a great proponent of this, as well as Laura and Phil here. The one thing I want to talk about is actually innovation. Innovation in data is a 4-letter word, and I'd like to set the stage a little bit for that, because we're all struggling with how do we move to the next world order. And I guess the first question I need to answer is, who am I and what do I do, and how does that fit with the CDO of the Department of Defense? We're a role player, and we represent the community of acquisition and transformation related to data and analytics, and using data and analytics to inform, decide, and innovate across the Department of Defense. And we're now on that journey to move forward with that. I'll see if I get my clicker right here. These are your charts, correct?
They are.
They are. All right, so in our charts, you can ignore the charts for right now. There'll be Phil's what he's talking to. In the core deck, we formed a foundation in the department, and I'll have to talk to my chart. So visually understand that what do we represent? I am in the office of the Acquisition Enablers, which is a key organization serving the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for acquisition. And in there, the roles that we cover are policy, process, data management, and analytics. And the role is to lead the department and serve the department, because we're not the decision makers, but enable the department to make better decisions, well-informed decisions, to set patterns for us to adopt new practices, and write policy that enable the programs in the Department of Defense to move forward. To give you a sense of the way I think about the programs in the Department of Defense, there are roughly about 100 or so major programs that account for over $1.7 trillion. Second to that, the smaller programs represent probably 2,000 to 3,000 that we count that way of lower tier programs. And we also have multiple pathways which these programs can execute in, whether they're executing in software, major capabilities, rapid acquisition, services, business systems, because they're all unique in their own supply chains and considerations in the decision making. And the layering of the department is, for those of you who had the benefit of me talking to them at any one of the tables, we don't have the money. It's in the programs, it's in the services, it's in the components, and underlying all of those are hardware, technology, software, and those considerations are best considered where they are. So today, we hope to explore the newest component of what I would call, Robert said AIRC. We call it AIRC. The previous Assistant Secretary coined the term, but the Acquisition Innovation Research Center. Something that we established, statute told us, Congress gave us a little bit of help with this, to establish an innovation center to address research, pilot, model in a very rapid fashion. So we could further innovate, work with industry, work with academia, leverage thoughts of what we don't know, and looking at the other side of the equation. It is critically important for us to do that, and I know, Phil, I'm going to ask you to probably go first, because you're going to go.
Well, your slides are now.
Your slides are now available.
Oh, my slides are now available. All right, we aren't looking at that. All right, for those of you, you can grade me on how well did I paint the visual framework here, but working from left to right, left are all the policies. They're instantiated across the department policy framework. We took a number of years to get that right, to create flexibilities at a policy layer. Moving from left to right, the processes and the operational layer of urgent capability acquisition, middle tier of acquisition, services, what we talked about, how we think about process, to the bottom. The data cube, which I administer in my other role as the Director of Enterprise Information, of what data, where, how does that work? And ultimately to the bottom left quadrant, how do we measure our performance with data analytics, predictive analytics, what applications we're doing, why do they matter, and how do they fit? All of that is critically important and foundational in this, but it's not in and of itself good enough. It is actually how we serve, if we move to the right, the decision framework of the Department of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And in the layers of the organization, the Deputy and the Secretary and the Deputy who has the role of overseeing all of this, we work within the acquisition community to do integrated program reviews, reviewing about 10 or so of the most programs. We also work with the service executives and complete monthly, quarterly reviews of those programs. We've also adopted a new strategy, looking at programs in portfolios, so an integrated portfolio reviews, and working with the joint staff to make sure that the requirements are there. It is a complicated environment, so data in and of itself is not good enough. I refer to this as the governance framework in many regards of what we're leading the department to change. So, where are we going? I'll let over the horizon. Now I will go to Phil. So if you wouldn't mind pulling Phil's charts up.
They should just all go.
It should be in their next one.
We hope they will.
There we go.
Great. So, well, thank you, Mark, and good morning, you all. So, I'm Philip Anton. Laura Freeman, Dr. Freeman, and I are both supporting the department through this Acquisition Innovation Research Center. It's different than most things. It's a part of the university-affiliated research center, but it's a collaborative partnership, not just of one university, but of many universities. So the idea is to leverage capabilities across those areas, and in our case, applying it to innovating defense acquisition. Focus more on the organizational process. How do we get the process of doing acquisition to be innovative so that we can produce innovative capabilities out the other end, as opposed to focusing just on, technology. We're both technologists and statisticians and so on, but it's really trying to think organizationally out of the box, and how do we improve policies, how do we improve processes and so on to be able to have acquisition be better. So we're focusing on something we're calling a digital acquisition. It's really thinking about data and information to improve acquisition functions and capabilities. Again, ultimately to get those capabilities out to the warfighters in efficient fashion, saving money for taxpayers, and in trying to improve speed. A lot of the reason why we're doing this is some of you know, if you're following in the defense sector, the threats are moving faster. They have access to much more broader global capabilities. And so it's really challenging the department to move faster and to keep up with these threats. In addition, at the technological side, right, technology is moving faster and faster and faster. The department is normally moving very slow and methodical as it moves through to build capabilities. So how do we react to those two capabilities and move forward to improve acquisition outcomes? We have this as our working definition for what digital acquisition really means. It's really thinking about data, but also at information. So it could be information, it could be models, it could be the results of analysis, it could be knowledge, so higher level pieces of information. We want that to be pervasive so that it's available to people that are making decisions to move these processes forward as possible. The department tends to be rather stovepipe on data and information, so we want to change that to a much pervasive access. That involves a lot of cultural changes in the department, again, because it is very stovepipe. They're used to thinking about, I own the data. Well, you don't own the data. The warfighters and the taxpayers own the data. So how do we change that culture? So we're thinking about those aspects of it, bringing in psychologists and other folks to think about, well, what's motivating people? There's a reason why people are culturally motivated to operate in a certain fashion. Again, thinking about those processes, so it's acquisition functions, cost analysis, systems engineering, contracting, all of those functions, the decision-making, the processes, the policies, and so on. How do we improve all of those so that we ultimately have better outcomes for the warfighters? I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about challenges, but think about it. You already saw some of those. How do we get people to share? How do we get them to open up their systems? How do we get those accesses? In the Department of Defense, there are also security-related challenges that we have to address. We can't just dismiss them out of hand in dealing with these cultural areas. The good news is that technology has moved a lot, as we all know, over the last decades and continuing to accelerate. So there are a lot of technological opportunities that we think we can bring to bear to help address some of these areas, as well as leveraging other areas in academia that haven't necessarily been applied to it. Thinking about applying economics, psychologists, and so on, other disciplines for improving these processes. If you're up on where the Department of Defense is, there are lots of data strategies that are out there, either at the OSD level that Michael, I think, had contributed to, areas that Mark Krzysko had worked at. These are just some samples out of sort of the guiding principles that are out there. They say the right things. The interesting thing is we're now thinking, okay, how do I make this real? What kinds of specific things can we do to make these guiding principles real, to change effects in the department? And that's a lot of what Dr. Freeman and I are thinking through, and the rest of our teams in other universities, about how do we actually do this? What exactly would I do for contract writing that would make it better? And leveraging all of these data principles in that specificity. Of course, in the data system in the Department of Defense, these are a lot of the limitations. You're familiar with some of these. We see these in industry as well. The department's very document-driven. When we do have digital data, it's a very data field-driven. Sometimes it's structured. A lot of times it isn't. I get free text. What can I do with that? So we're trying to apply natural language processing to understand that, but it's much more of a challenge to deal with it. We talked about stovepiped, very limited interoperability, lots of progress recently in some areas to improve that, and the department's continuing to do that in particular areas, but that's still a challenge that we're working with. The incentives aren't there, so we're trying to think about how do we align incentives so that it's not just the most conservative, the most protected piece of structure around a particular data, but trying to think about managing risk to get the data to the right individuals that need it, while we're also thinking about things like security. The transparency is difficult out there. A lot of folks are not viewing this as a partnership. Individual services within the services, sometimes even that is not shared and operating. And then, of course, the security and access. Just to give you a sample of, here's some ideas that we've been working through. These are initial thoughts about what we could do that could actually, again, improve acquisition. So in the systems engineering world, they're looking at model-based acquisition, if you're following any of that area. So rather than providing a specification that's on paper with particular requirements, the department can give them a model. Here's a representation of what we want this new capability to do. Okay, so that's a much richer understanding. It's moving from paper and documents to models. And then we can use those models as a way to think about the capabilities and how they interact, individual capabilities to interact in an ecosystem. And we're working at portfolio levels to try to think about how to make those improvements. And then also sharing that with contractors to say, look, again, here's this model of this capability I need you to build. They'll build much more capable models. Their designs would be in a model-based system and ultimately produce capabilities that move out into operations, and then we would get feedback as a system, as we're always getting that feedback. But we can take that richer piece of information and put that into the center green box. Those are all the PM functions. You can actually take, for example, the model representation of the acquisition and give that to a cost estimator, and they can get weights off of it. They can run through the same kinds of algorithms and the same kinds of approaches they do to estimate costs, but use that with a much richer piece of information. When the model gets updated because the design changed, they can very quickly update the cost estimate. You know, that's something that we can't do right now. Oftentimes we'll do one cost estimate and we end up living with it for a long time. So just to, again, give you an example of, we're trying to think out of the box about, well, what does this mean anyways, digital acquisition? What can I actually change in all of those acquisition functions? Don't I just have to do cost estimating? Don't I have to do, you know, contract writing in the same old way that I've always done it? But no, we're trying to pursue those particular areas. And then there are a lot of other data information that are flowing, production data, intellectual property repositories, and so on, really trying to think about a better ecosystem and a better data-driven ecosystem to help improve that acquisition. So again, thinking about data in a different fashion, so continuing to include information sharing, but also thinking about better ways of representing information and improving that sharing amongst those elements of the acquisition system. And then ultimately, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Freeman to talk about some of these innovative ideas that we're working through in acquisition, and I'll just go through it because I think Laura's going to go through this in more detail for you. But trying to think about, for example, I have secure information, right? I still have to protect it, but I have other people that need access. They don't necessarily have the credentials. They don't necessarily have access to the same computers. Are there techniques from industry or from academia that we can use to try to get access to that, to be able to do, say, an analysis on those particular pieces of information without compromising those pieces of information? So we're trying to think through how do we deal with security in a much more sophisticated fashion. And over to Dr. Freeman.
Thanks, Phil. Which one is just the big one?
The big
right?
one.
Yeah.
The big red button.
Oh, the big red button.
The green.
So before talking about the more tactical elements of the approach that we're taking to try and bring the best ideas from academia and non-traditional DoD partners into decision-making and defense acquisition, I want to talk a little bit about why this is so hard. And I didn't know I had so many builds in here. So I want to contrast the DoD and the challenges that we have in DoD data with what is best practices from types of organizations that you could think of as data transformation leaders. So I've got a picture of a casino floor up there, and some of this comes from a colleague of mine who did a review of lots of digital transformation, data transformation leaders. And she identified, there's all sorts of studies out there, and I like this because it's 3 constructs and I can remember 3 constructs. But key elements that made companies successful in doing data transformation and digital transformation. And those were that they own their own data and that they define their own processes, technologies, algorithms with that data, and then they use data to drive decision making. So I want to start with the last one because that's, to me, the most important one. If a decision maker isn't using data, eventually things are going to go stale. And in the department, I think we've heard a lot of emphasis on we want to use data. Mark's been pushing really hard. We want to use data to improve acquisition decisions. We're hearing it from the most senior leadership. David Spurk covered a lot of that in our opening keynote on Tuesday. And so there's this big kind of incentive, yeah, we want to use data. But then it's to answer what questions, what specific questions do we have, and do we actually have the data to answer those questions, and is it in a format that we can actually use it? And so that goes back to own the own data. Phil said, he brought this up in his comments that, yeah, the department owns their data, but it's maybe within each of the components, so it's within a service or within a specific program executive office within the services. And also, I was happy to hear David Spurk address this, that the silos are starting to break down, and it's not so much of the cultural issues anymore, but now the question is how? How do we exchange that data? And is it worth the effort to get the data into common formats that people can share across the services that can be sent to OSD to support these higher level decisions? Because everyone's developed their own proprietary, working with industry partners, proprietary methods for calculating things from the data. Do we need to go back and re-engineer those? Those are the questions that we're facing right now, which brings to that second point there, that we need those kind of tools built into the process. And I put up the picture of the casino because this is my absolute favorite one, because just every time you walk onto a casino floor, everything from the players' cards that they give you to where they're positioning machines, that's all data-driven. And that really is going to be the place we need to get to ultimately drive data decisions in the department, because right now it's very manual, and manual processes always break down, and they're subject to human error and flaws as we move data around. And so this is kind of the context that we're working in to try and solve these problems. And so I want to hit kind of what we're doing tangibly right now to try and pilot new approaches to data within the AIRC supporting MARC. So right now we're in the first year of a pilot project to try and break down these barriers. And not just break down barriers within the department, because I can't influence that in my position at Virginia Tech, but help the department leverage external analysts within academia. So the question came up on Tuesday about data democratization and how we might start to make this data actually available to what you flagged, Phil, the taxpayers and people that could actually help bring scale to the amount of analysis and the insights that we could do in acquisition. And so I like to think about these pilots that we're doing right now as kind of the first step, because of course DoD data that's sensitive needs to be protected, and we need to do it in the right way. But how do we take public and unclassified data and remove that type of information to make it available to generate kind of a larger population of people that can generate insights from that data and support decision makers in the department? And so that's what we're working on right now, and I'll go in a little bit more into deep dives. But how do we, consolidate data, get it in the right format, make it machine learning ready, if you will, but analysis ready once, so that it can be used by all, and we stop kind of reworking all the data cleaning, the data wrangling that has to be done to get to the more innovative analysis things that we can do with it. And so here's our approach. Phil went through IDEAS, which is the Innovative Data-Enabled Acquisition Strategy. So we started from a strategy. And that strategy drives kind of all the decision-making that we're doing from a technology standpoint. But essentially, it's, all of you are very familiar with probably standing up data pipelines and information architectures to do these things. But it's the storage, it's the compute, it's the actual data itself that we're going to use to drive innovation in that secure environment. That's what we're calling the data vault. The hub, how do you access the data? There's vast amounts of data. Even in the 2 pilot data sets that we're playing with right now, huge amounts of data that's not easily digestible. How do you get a user onto the system, have them running queries, doing exploratory analysis, making nice plots, and exploring what they can do with it, understanding what the 50 columns of data or 200 columns of data actually mean and what those could actually do for you. And then finally, the analytical harness. There we're working on 2 types of tools. One is in the privacy area. This is a huge area of academic research right now, everything from differential privacy to federated learning to differential privacy layered on top of federated learning, anonymization techniques. These are active things that are being researched right now. The lens that we're looking at it is not, what's the next new best method, but how do I take what academia has been doing in the last couple of years and convince MARC that this works and it's going to be safe, and if you use this method and then we share the data, nothing's going to come back that's, this information was then leaked to the public. And so we're doing this in a kind of a crawl, walk, run approach. in that if we do that first with only partners that we've filtered and vetted and have the right accesses, and then we try and get them to break the system, go show that you can recover some PII from this, then we know it didn't work. But if they can't, that's data point one to trying to convince our decision makers that this is something that we could use to make data accessible. And so that's kind of the data democracy element that we're looking on it. And then we also, I'm a statistician, so of course I have great faith that our predictive and prescriptive models will have or generate useful insights for decision makers in the department. But David Spurk on Tuesday also raised the point that we don't want to get over our skis with these. And so all models are wrong, some are useful is a statistician's favorite quote. We need to understand where these models are useful and where the parts where they're wrong could actually lead to erroneous decision making. And that's another area where having kind of this external analyst pool can really help in the troubleshooting of, this model works here, but be careful over here, and kind of having those tags and labels that go with our data so we have a really good understanding of where they work and where they break down. So Phil, I think we move the arrows about once a week on this chart on who's going where, what's going on. But the basic concept I've already really laid out, that we have the data in the compute and storage environment where it is protected at the appropriate level. And then the analytic harness is either filtering it so that it can be exposed in some way, or making it searchable for the users. And we've broken those users into kind of the unpermissioned, completely external, which is a reach goal for the future, and then right now really focusing on DoD, those university partners that Phil talked about, maybe the FFRDC's national labs, those types of users that might use those data and have the appropriate permissions. But ultimately, where we want to end up is really on the far side of this slide. We want to be able to provide decision makers with all sorts of tools and insights that help them make their decisions in a more informed and defensible way. And for our pilot infrastructure, I'll just kind of start at the bottom here. This is, the boring slide maybe, and that what we're doing is kind of builds from the environment that we're setting up, the CUI, controlled unclassified information environment, with a nice desktop user interface where people can log in. But sitting behind that is high performance computing, GPU, CPU, that'll enable researchers to leverage machine learning and AI tools. To then access our next layer up, the data, where we've got 2 pilot data sets involved in that. Right now, this publicly available SAM.gov data, and then earned value management data, which Phil highlighted earlier. And then the filtering tools that we talked about, differential privacy and federated learning, because ultimately where we think insights are going to come to inform decision makers is not in any one of these data sets, but our ability to link them across the different acquisition functions and incorporate those into common analyses. And then on the very top layer is just how we engage the researcher, wherever that researcher might be, in the interface through a nice user interface with query tools, search tools, to explore what's in the data set, exploratory data analysis, nice pretty pictures to kind of understand what they're working with. But really want to foot stomp that end goal is really having this secure environment for innovative research to inform decision makers in the Department of Defense and the acquisition system. And so with that, I will stop and turn it over to Michael.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm going to go without slides because when I looked at the slides that my fellow panel members put together, I thought that they covered the space pretty extensively. And the best contribution I could make was to add a bit of color as a data leader. So I'm gonna start on the left and come this way. We're talking about the acquisition space. If you've not worked in the DoD, acquisition is about buying major capital assets. It's about buying F-35 fighter jets. It's about buying Virginia-class submarines. It's about buying Stryker land vehicles and Abrams tanks. These are incredibly sophisticated engineering projects with a wide variety of inputs. The F-35, in its initial release, just to control the airframe, had 6.4 million lines of code. That's not navigation, that's not weather, that's not targeting, that's not kinetic effects. That's just running the airplane, and it's a bigger number now. These are very sophisticated programs with a lot of engineering parameters. And here's the fun thing. While the department has niches of excellence in data and analytics that are every bit as sophisticated as anything you can find in the commercial sector, they are niches. It's not broadly characteristic of the department. The phrase I like to use is this: most of the department's data is incomplete. And when it's complete, it's often incorrect. And when it's correct, it's often inexact, not enough precision. And when it's exact, it's almost always in arrears. So it's a little bit like driving backwards down the highway looking in your rearview mirror. This is a very challenging data environment. And achieving the goals that we've seen here require very high caliber of talent, which is why I'm delighted to be here, because I get to learn from a very high level of talent. So when you're in this environment and you're coping with the data quality issues, it's easy to take refuge in the fact that, oh, well, we have the roughly 10,000 operational IT systems. They were put in place by different people at different places, different teams, different points in time, different budgets, different requirements, different risk tolerances, therefore different metadata, et cetera. But the reality is the department is not unique in this. You go to any large financial services institution and you'll find one or two more orders of magnitude of systems. You might find 100,000 systems. You might find over 1 million systems. The department might talk about a big data challenge as a tabular database with, I don't know, 10, 20, 30,000 columns. Financial services institutes have SQL tables with 500 million columns. So the solutions are available to us, the techniques are available to us, the technologies are available to us. The challenge, as I think it was you highlighted, Dr. Freeman, is bringing these capabilities from the commercial sector and getting them into operations inside the DoD. Well, this is a well understood challenge. I worked on it when I was in the department. Dave Spark worked on it when he was in the department. Mark's been working on it since roughly dirt was invented, and he's younger than I am, so that's why I know. But making progress, we have now reached the point where I think we have enough critical mass of investment in talent above all, because talent's first, and now techniques and technologies, which puts us in a position to be able to make an enormous step forward. And we have senior executives in the department, like the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Hicks, the Honorable Hicks, who has an appetite for asking tough, critical business questions and expecting reliable answers. Or as statisticians would say, expecting high levels of precision, acceptable levels of recall, good accuracy, good validity. At the same time, we've got a long way to go. So let me put in this world, we're data professionals, let me put a number on how far we have to go. Govini released their data analytics, decision science taxonomy, looking at the FY21 budget of the DoD, and what they identified, if you look at all of the decision analytics, so data engineering up through data science, the percentage of the DoD spend that went to private equity-backed and venture capital-backed firms was 4%. Now let's acknowledge that private equity-backed and venture capital-backed firms are the economic engine of innovation in this country. The DoD was able to spend 4% of their decision analytics dollars in that space. In other words, the barriers are still there. We're not able to get the kind of adoption that we want. I'll give you a second statistic, which is if you look at some of the progress that's been made around acquisition reform, it's allowed for what's called OTAs, other transaction authorities. And the portion of decision analytics spend that flew through OTAs in that study was 3%. And so the real root cause of these challenges, as Phil highlighted, and as Dr. Freeman highlighted, is culture. We still have a culture that is change averse. It's not risk averse, it's change averse. The department knows how to manage risk, and it does it with panache every single day. It's an amazing thing to behold, but change is a different story. And as Mark Twain once said, yeah, we're all for progress. We just can't stand change. So that I think remains the challenge for us. Wouldn't you say, Mark? We still have a bit of a challenge with.
Since I'm older than dirt, I do recognize that it is a long journey in that change. But I think, I come at it always from the business side. I sense that we're approaching, if not there, the tipping point. It has been a journey to get us here. And, I really do thank Rich. I thank this forum for helping us formulate our thinking. The aspect of us engaging with you, the audience, you, the vendor, you, our colleagues, have formulated, and I shouldn't say this in front of my academicians, we're copying other people's homework too. We're learning, we're listening to you. We're developing those skills no matter where we come from to bring that into our institution. I say this, and sometimes the vendors may take umbrage. If you had the perfect piece of software, we would have bought it by now. It's not, that is only a piece of the puzzle. And it's the adoption, it's the people, it's the transition. And to try to move the topic back and coming at it from a mission perspective, the foundation really are data and analytics. But it's mission improvement, mission delivery, and innovative practices which are the goal. And we should never lose sight of that. We cannot, I don't know, a long time ago, I guess after Dirt was born, I had one boss say to me, she told me I should never say the word architecture. I could never use the word architecture in front of her. She didn't care. She cared about results.
Right.
She cared about mission, and how I got there was my matter. And whether it's data and analytics, it's how the contribution is here. So being mindful of time and recognizing that we have 20 minutes, and Robert over there was a good job of keeping me on time. I'd like to ask you all, what would you like to hear from us? What questions do you have?
Mark, actually, we have got quite a strong online presence as well. There's 148, and it's just been increasing by 2 or 3. It looks like people have finally woken up and had their coffee. So for our attendees in the audience, if you do have a question, there is a microphone there as well. So what I'll do is, if you just want to step up, I will see you. And if not, I will go to the online questions, because there's over 10 questions there. So, but I do see some people lining up as well. So I'll wait until these guys ask their questions, and I'll be on standby. Mark, just call me whenever you want to get a question. So, Ed.
Thank you. Great panel and discussion. Appreciate the transparency. I'm very interested in how you're all thinking about unstructured data and image related data as well, and the rapid growth of this and the processing of all that. Thank you.
I'll jump in. Because I was on a call as we were working on our pilot right now yesterday with my team, and I was like, why is this data set not up yet? And they were like, unstructured data problems. The dates were in different formats. There's a lot of text over here. Oh, yeah. Different metadata, some of it is structured, some of it not. And then also with the images, which is, can be tagged with structured data. But so I think the more structure you can provide to the data, the better analytics you're going to get out of it. That's just like the universal truth in my mind. The more, if you can have labeled data, you're going to get better predictive models. If you have structure to the columns, you are then able to tag, and especially when we're talking about multiple data sets across other multiple departments. structure is good. And so we're approaching that with adding as much structure. When I mentioned, the clean the data, wrangle the data once, share for all. That's really what we're talking about there, is adding as much structure as we can, doing things like resolving LMCO equals Lockheed Martin Corporation, and trying to fix those types of things. But also there are some tools out there that help guide structure in the data. So exploratory data analysis. In the image space, we've been doing a lot of latent space representations of the data to try and understand, can we layer on structure with an algorithm, which is going to be a lot faster. In the text field, there's lots of natural language processing techniques that allow you to cluster and group things faster and say, oh, this is a common set of documents that all say the same thing or they have the same sentiment. And so applying those tools as much as possible as well. And then I think the only thing I really have to add on the image space before turning it over to anyone else is that there is structure in images that can be tagged with it. So we've been spending a lot of time making sure that every image has all the associated metadata associated with it, tagging it, and then again, understanding what's represented in that image. And again, if you can have labels or some understanding of the makeup of that image through latent space representations, that gets you a leg up when you start to use it for analysis down the road.
Yeah. I would just add that, as an illustration, there are some examples going on in the department. It's not in AIRC, but using, say, sentiment analysis and natural language processing on a text. So we get a program manager's report, it's in a text response, you say, well, all right, are there any problems here? Which ones do we need to elevate up to the boss? They do a green, yellow, red on their own site, but some of these preliminary research has shown that, the greens aren't always green. You look at them and go, well, wow, I would have marked that one yellow. I mean, someone needs to at least know about it, if not check in and see if there's some help that needs to be made. So there's some of those kinds of things to deal with, purely unstructured, natural prose. But again, it's early on in that particular application.
So I just want to add a little bit to that to talk about the culture perspective. So I was just teaching at DAU or having a segment on data and analytics, and we were talking about predictive analytics in green and white. And the program managers for many of the programs that we were talking about, maybe 40 so, they said, what words do I need to write so I don't get predicted that way? And they're thinking about it as, and differentiating and getting their minds around the techniques of what we're doing. Program managers have been so hardwired for cost, schedule, performance, and risk within their own silo, and they get graded on that, they get judged on that. Right. Yet we have to adjudicate a national defense strategy, which involves the Army, Navy, and Air Force, multiple programs that are coming online, programs that are online, and programs that are in sustainment. And you're thinking, how do you support the department in that? And that is a role for OSD, and our thinking is changing about how to do that. Not just be an order checker on programs, but be thinking about analysis, mission completion, and thinking across the best so we can better be stewards of the taxpayers.
Right. And that's a great example as to why, right, we talk a lot about why technology and data science and everything, we have to understand the domain. Well, why is it that they're behaving this way? Mm-hmm. Well, they're behaving this way because if they have problems, then they get people from on high coming down and descending them, and they're trying to solve this problem. As opposed to how do we get acquisition to help them when they need help and leave them alone when they need to be left alone. It's those kinds of understandings. So there's more that needs to go on purely almost on the acquisition side, informed by data, but on the acquisition side so that the system works better and doesn't have these negative consequences. And people go, geesh, it's great. When I need help, I go ask my boss and I get help, and otherwise they leave me alone. That's where we need to get to when we're still not there in terms of just almost pure acquisition, policy and approach and processes.
Solomon, I know you were standing there.
Yes, my name is Solomon. I'm from South Africa. And for our sins, we developed the South African Air Force Navy systems in the 80s, 90s. And then when Mandela was released, we sold it on to the Royal Air Force. But that led to a program which was actually some of the startup programs with this conference before the CDO. And that was with DLIS out of Battle Creek. And that was the automation or a .com sort of focus onto the NATO system and the whole fix, etc., and to computerize that. Now, we've done a lot of work in 2008, 2009, and 22745 was developed out of that. Now, my belief is all of that initiative, we tested that on the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier at some time. And it was an XML, but my belief was it was ahead of its time. So this morning when I saw all these slides, it was so familiar, and I'm so glad that somebody is taking up some of this work. So my question is, what happened to 22745? It was there to have an automatic exchange between industry, and again, we got involved with a lot of other military work in the Middle East. So we saw the same F-16s from a buyer perspective, and we put in Oman's system, and we had to get all those parts and stuff into the SAP system and automate it. And it's a huge problem in terms of getting clean data, etc. But it seems to me there's a lack of mapping those initiatives, and especially where we are right now. So is there anything happening on that, or we're right in time now?
I don't have an answer for that.
But let me give you a start to an answer. One of the biggest challenges we have with those kinds of guidelines and standards is we publish them in PDFs, PowerPoints, and Word documents. None of those are data. None of those are executable. None of those are machine readable until I put them through an NLP pipeline. And for years, we haven't had NLP pipelines to apply to them. And therefore, what we've created is a wonderful North Star to aim at, but we're navigating with a blindfold on. We need to treat standards, if we're going to have data exchange standards or other data standards, we need to treat them as software configuration items, put them in software repos, and make them available to people as already tested software with test data and test scripts so that they can apply them in their systems as software configuration items. For decades, we have not done that. For decades, we've created standards and techniques that nobody applies because they take too long and cost too much, and it's too unpredictable. We'll take SFIS as an example, which is published by the Department of the Treasury, and you're required, if you have a system that executes financial transactions, you must be SFIS compliant. Well, we're 6 or 7 releases into SFIS, and if you look across the audit notices of findings and recommendations, you'll find that there are lots of systems that are supposed to be SFIS compliant that aren't, lots that claim to be SFIS compliant but aren't, and it's because we're still publishing the damn things as something other than software configuration items. So the specific data standard you mentioned was handled that way, it's still handled that way, and until we reform the way we handle standards for data and metadata, we're not going to get successful adoption and implementation. And yes, we have compensating mechanisms in the data engineering world, as Dr. Freeman mentioned, and NLP has a role and so forth, but there's a degree of inexactness to all of that. And we have to change the way we manage it. It's one of the reasons, if you read Dave Spurk's goodbye letter, which was published in Breaking Defense a few weeks back, he specifically challenges the notion that standards are the solution to our problems. And it's something that I've been pretty adamant about as well. I hope that was a helpful answer.
Thank you for that honest answer. The good news is it went commercial, and as we speak, it's live under ISO 8000. And a lot of those exchanges enhance, and it's run by industry right now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I do want to add and pile on a little bit to further that, because Michael's point, it just honed on me, and that was the chart that we talked about. We wrote policy for decades.
Right.
And if you look at the quad chart, which I pulled back up, the left is the policy.
Right.
And you can't, it's a generally described operations. It never was good enough for data, and I was always tipping at that problem. But we have thought about it a little bit differently in a tractable problem, and I can't answer for everybody else, but I would let anybody copy the homework. We looked at our policy, looked at our processes, understood and put some rigor around that, and created a data model based upon that with the linkages to that policy, because it had to get to operational. And the data, we have historically thought about systems as something different from what we do. We have historically thought of data as something else, something we use, but not something we need to manage. By creating what I call the acquisition data visibility framework, we documented this data, the standards, the bias, all the way back to policy, and put that in a database. So the services and components could pivot on that. This past week, I just signed the last one, so each one of the pathways, we've documented the core data available with that. Because ultimately, it gets into the use, into the visualizations. So while I can't answer for that specific one, I can tell you operationally how we thought about it in a tractable problem of taking it beyond, and it was a lot of door knocking on policy. My colleague Mark Hogemiller will say, hey, when we get to policy, where's the data pieces of this? Where's our coordination? Because we have got to make it real. And I think that was a really emerging practice.
You know, Mark, just at the OSD level, so this is above the services and the defense agencies and field activities, the department has 125,000 pages of policy documents in PDFs. 6 million words, 125,000 pages. What human being can hold this in their head? What human being can find what they need? The answer is none, which is why the Advana organization has Game Changer, which is an NLP engine, a relatively sophisticated NLP engine that helps people get to the policy insights they need. But until you make policy machine readable, put it through that process, do all the entity recognition, et cetera, until you make it machine readable, you can't use it as business rules. Think about what we do in the world of cybersecurity. We write policy that's machine readable that goes into your firewalls. That's what IT professionals in the cyber world do all the time. It needs to be the same for all policy. And Mark, I'm really delighted to hear about the progress your team has made.
So we'll come to the gentleman up there who's been patiently waiting just to give you 5-minute warning, and also let you know that David Spurk is actually watching. He's one of the now 151 folks that are watching your session online.
Hey,
so he
Dave.
wanted to say
Hi, Dave.
great leadership from the team. So fantastic on that. So gentlemen up there on the right-hand side.
Sure. Thank you all for your contribution today. Laura, I think it was you that went through different privacy-enhancing technologies. You talked about differential privacy and federated learning. It's awesome to see that you're not just looking at one tool or another, but combining them to solve actual problems, and that's something that we see with other agencies and also in the commercial space. I'm curious about two things. One, how far along are you on this journey in that pilot infrastructure slide that you shared? And second, have you considered other methods as well, like synthetic data or homomorphic encryption? Why or why not?
Yeah, so we're at how far along we are. We're very pilot prototyping right now. So we've implemented methods that are out there in the research, basically. And we did consider, we haven't done homomorphic, because I can't say it, so we're not doing it. No, homomorphic encryption.
Just go with FHE.
No, we haven't done it yet, but looking at, right now we've really focused on those algorithms, but we have a running list of things that we've reviewed. Synthetic data, so synthetic data is only as good as the problem that you're trying to solve. And so we'd actually need to have the exact problem that we want to solve to generate the synthetic data that looks like the real data. So we're waiting for the right opportunity to leverage that one, but we've gone through everything from anonymization techniques to encryption techniques and starting to also look at not just the algorithmic, I kind of bend them into like rule-based, algorithm-based, and then architecture-based. And so distributed ledger technologies and zero trust architectures are other things that we need to consider. We just started where we started. So great question, but I would say we're in our crawl stage of this. We've implemented things that are available and we can run them in the nice CUI environment, but definitely more to come and more to explore. Thanks.
So Mark, we'll pick the most popular voted question so far from the audience that is virtual, and I'd like to thank the virtual audience. If you have got questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll try and get as many answered as possible. So first one was, how do you reconcile the slow pace of establishing and adopting standards versus the rapid pace of innovation and experimentation it requires?
I'll take that one because why would you want to adopt a standard? And if it wasn't yours, it better bring value to you. And the key, and I would call this the master stroke, and learned it from multiple conferences, my partners were key. And having a customer service view of what the Army, Navy, and Air Force needed, wanted, and we could collaborate on the standards. The Army, Navy, and Air Force will tell you they have adopted the standards and they've copied our homework. They will answer me, thank you very much. It became a foil for their transformations internally when they were trying to create their organizational internal alignment. We did it as a community. They adopted it. They are instrumenting that into their systems. But the value was that they recognized the value. And the master stroke is the partnership across the organization. And that requires, I always say, a deft hand and strong leadership. And you have to listen to them. Inflicting a standard is the wrong answer because they will tell you what will work and why it won't. And using their and giving them a voice piece is a part of establishing the standard. We could recognize our own failings with what we were doing. And I think that's the key to standard adoption. It's the partner of who you really are working with and listening and effectively moving through that. I do realize I took on a tractable problem, 500 or so pieces of standards for all those, but it is extensible. I think the techniques are the same. The issues may be bigger, but the techniques are there.
So Mark, just in the last minute, maybe I can get just a quick update from each of you on this question that was posted. What key learnings can you share with us about adoption of disruptive innovation in the non-defense sectors? Does that make sense? So I'll read that question. What key learnings can you share with us about adoption of disruptive innovation in the non-defensive sectors? And maybe a quick answer from all of you as we're coming to the end here. Does that make sense?
Why don't I go first, Mark?
Yes, sir.
Disruptive innovation in the non-defense sector, let me give you a number. In my opinion, the half-life of techniques and technologies in the world of ML and AI is 6 to 9 months. Therefore, if you're not doing something new in 12 to 18 months, you're falling behind the other guy. And if you're in the non-defense sector, that probably means you're in the world of commercial competition, and falling behind the other guy is not what you want to do. There's my first answer. 6 to 9 months is the half-life. Are you moving fast enough would be my challenge to us all. Anybody else?
I'm going to go back to my original slide on data adoption or data transformation, and those was all based on the non-defense sector. And again, it all comes down to leadership. So move fast, but that's only going to happen if leadership is driving that forward. And also, I think you can jump on that curve pretty quickly. And the data science community is very kind of open infrastructure publishing, and so I think there's opportunities across all sectors to jump up on that curve very quickly with the tools and the techniques, and get the right person in place that can help you digest those. And you can, it's okay if you got behind, you can catch up.
So maybe leadership helps us move fast in the right direction.
Hopefully.
Phil, any last minute?
All right, I'll go really quickly here because I know we're over time here.
It's okay. We'll give you the
Randy Bean has a book out there, Fail Fast, Learn Faster. Big fan, I'll Get Struck by Lightning, Harvard University, Clay Christensen, Disruptive Innovation. Big model in my mind of how do we do this. When we talk about it from AIRC and the instantiation of AIRC and having them do innovation, I don't think about failures. I think about what did we learn.
Right.
It's not about failing. It's about learning, adopting, adjusting. And I think in the business term, you will hear a key word come out. It's about the pivot. How quickly can you pivot? It's not, don't think about it as a grand thing. Pivots are turns, so you make the turns and you adopt as quickly as you can. I know we're out of time. I do want to thank my distinguished colleagues. I will tell you the key to this is collaborate, work with people that are smarter than you, and give them a lot of runway.
So Mark, on behalf of the Symposium and your panelists, thank you very much indeed. And the audience here and our audience online, thank you.